Hello. This video is intended to introduce you to some common terms that we use in scientific research, specifically how we talk about variables and what a hypothesis is. So this sounds really obvious, but variables are things that vary. They can come in a variety of forms. You might see it as a letter in an equation. It might be a column in a data set. It could be just a measure of a concept that has more than one value, because the important distinction I want to draw here is between variables and values. Variables are the overall measurement, and values are the actual individual pieces of data within a variable. For example, if a variable was regime type, the values could be democracy or dictatorship. Or if the variable is a measure of corruption, the values could be a number between 0 and 100. There are two different ways that we talk about variables, both by their function in the research that people do, and the type of data, the type of values itself within the variable. I'll talk about the type of data first because that's pretty straightforward. The first important thing to note is that all of these terms about the type of data refer to numerical data only. Even when the data might be described with words, it's still being used in some sort of quantitative analysis. So there are three main types of numerical data. Binary variables have a value that is either 0 or 1, a yes or a no. For some reason I've never quite understood, these variables are also called dummy variables. So, for example, a binary variable on a survey could be a question that asks, did you vote in the last election or not? A yes would be a 1, and a no would be a 0. Categorical variables are variables that have categories. Sometimes categorical variables have an order to them. For example, a variable measuring the level of education could have a category for high school education, some college education, graduated college, some postgraduate education, etc. There's a clear order and ranking to those categories. Other categorical variables don't have any particular order. An example here is a variable for a category of religion. Categories could be Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc., but there's no particular order to them. Finally, a continuous variable is a variable that has a range of numbers. Examples include the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index and World Bank governance indicators. I'm introducing these terms for type of data to you for two reasons. First, it is useful vocabulary to know, but it's also true that you can only do certain types of analysis with certain types of variables. And so this is one thing that you can look for when you're reading empirical research. The terms that we use to describe the function of variables are much more important. First off, I'd like to note that when we use these terms, these don't necessarily refer to numerical variables. These terms, again, are about the function of a variable in research, and so can apply to more general concepts, any indicators, or any measure that you're using in research. Second, I'm going to talk more about cause and effect in a separate video. So don't worry too much about what exactly I mean by cause and effect and control variables right now. We'll get to that later. For now, I just want to make sure that these terms are familiar to you. So first, while we're really hesitant to call things causes in political science because it's just really difficult to prove, the variable, though, that you think is a cause or is a potential cause is called the independent variable. There are a bunch of ways that we refer to this. Sometimes we abbreviate it IV for independent variable. Sometimes they're called treatment variables. Sometimes they're called explanatory variables. In each case, though, we're talking about a cause, and in an equation, it gets abbreviated X. When you want to talk about the effect, that's called the dependent variable. Again, abbreviated DV. Sometimes this is also called an outcome variable, and in an equation, it'll be referred to with the letter Y. There are two other important terms here, control and intervening variable. Both relate to how we talk about causes. If you want to show that one thing, for example, war, causes another, for example, states, you need to demonstrate that other explanations for state institutions are wrong. Those alternate explanations are called control variables or confounding variables because they mess up your causal relationship. By contrast, intervening variables will help your causal explanation. They describe the steps by which your cause leads to your effect. To give you some examples here, again, in Tilley's theory that war made the state, here war is the independent variable and state is the dependent variable. If we wanted to prove this as a causal argument, we would need to rule out other possibilities, for example, that culture created the state. In this example, culture is the control variable. And when we get into the details of Tilley's theory, his argument is that war leads to enhanced tax collection, which leads to the creation of state institutions. In this example, taxes and tax collection are the intervening variable. The other term I wanted to make sure you're familiar with right now is hypothesis. When we talk about hypotheses in political science, we're talking about something really specific. It is a proposed test of a broader theory, and it has to meet certain really specific criteria. It needs to, again, be specific and testable. It's going to examine the observable implications of a theory. There are some technical requirements, like it does need to be falsifiable. More importantly, a hypothesis needs to clarify what the variables of a theory are, what is the proposed cause and what is the proposed effect. And it needs to describe what the proposed relationship between those two things is. What goes up and what goes down. So to give an example from, again, using Tilley's theory of war made the state, Thies develops a hypothesis to actually test this theory in the context of Latin America. As I mentioned in the video on how to read an academic article, I really appreciate authors who write sentences like, "My hypothesis is," or who indicate it with an H1 or something like that. Thies is not quite so explicit about it, but he does state that external rivals should allow the state to augment its extractive capacity, while internal rivals should have the opposite effect in Latin America. This does describe the variables in the relationship, but a better way to phrase this as an actual hypothesis is in Latin America, so a phrase describing the scope first. As the number of international wars a state participates in increases, so here the number of international wars is the independent variable, its ability to extract resources from the population, or the tax ratio, also increases. So again, here you can see what the specific dependent variable is, tax ratio. You can also see what the proposed relationship between them is. So increase in number of wars leads to increase in tax collection by a state. It's a really specific test of the general theory that war made the state. Again, we'll be getting into more detail on cause and effect and reading statistics in later videos.